Okay, the hour being 10 o'clock, why don't we call to order the board meeting of the CalHFA Board of Directors. Welcome, everybody. Why don't we start with roll call, Melissa?
Yes. Ms. Avila Farias? Yes. Ms. Gallagher? Here. Secretary Imbastiani? Mr. Gunning?
Here.
Mr. Hunter?
Here.
Ms. Johnson Hall?
Here.
Mr. A.G. for Treasurer Ma?
Present.
Mr. Metcalf?
Present.
Ms. Von Koch-Liebert for Secretary Podesta?
Present.
Mr. Prince?
Here.
Mr. Russell?
Present.
Ms. Sotelo? Ms. Haig for Kate Gordon?
Present.
Ms. Lee for Ms. Bosler?
Here.
And Ms. Boatman Patterson.
Here.
Chairman, we do have a quorum.
All right, thank you, Melissa. Anyone had a chance to look at the minutes? Any comments, question, edits? Well, if there's all right, let's deem them approved. We can do that, Steve.
We can deem it.
We can do that. We can do
Without opposition.
Without, right. In terms of comments, I think most of you are aware that the legislature adjourns for its summer recess tomorrow. Some of us are very glad that's happening, as it means some time off. And I think Frances and I, it's been interesting over there these first 7 months in what's supposed to be a housing crisis, and the lack of legislation maybe, or appropriate legislation. But Frances, we certainly look forward to your report. I know we've been knee-deep in battles over there, and it's amazing sometimes how this legislature approaches this issue of housing. But with that, Tia, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, and we have a full house today, so thank you all for coming. I wanted to start off with acknowledging some of our program successes for the 18-19 fiscal year, since we have just coming off of that. And for the first time in several years, it appears that our multifamily lending volume will be exceeding our fiscal year 18-19 goals, which I'm so tickled pink about multifamily and all the hard work that they have done. This data is estimated because we still haven't had an audit on it, but it looks like our combined program goal was $415 million in volume. Currently, we show that we have reached $618 million, nearly 150% of our goal, and we'll be creating or preserving more than 3,000, well, actually creating more than 3,000 new units. Our permanent volume goal was $150 million, and we looks like we did $177 million. Our special needs housing MHSA volume, we had a goal of $15 million, and we reached $23 million. And our conduit volume was $250 million, and it looks like we've reached $418 million. So again, I'd like to recognize all of the hard work of multifamily. We know that's been our focus for the last couple of years, so it's very exciting. Turning to single family, they also had another banner year. They have exceeded their $1.5 billion goal for the fiscal year, securitizing more than $3.5 billion and assisting more than 12,000 households. And so let's give that shout out to the team on our single family side. Regarding our mixed income program update, you will recall SB2 in 2017 created a permanent source of affordable housing known as the Building Homes and Jobs Act. 15% of those funds are annually appropriated to CalHFA for the purpose of creating mixed income multifamily residential housing for low to moderate income households beginning in 2019. There was a NOFA, a Notice of Funding Availability for $40 million in funds, was released in February, and applications were due on April 30th. CalHFA received 13 applications and eventually selected 8 projects for preliminary awards. These 8 projects will be use $39.6 million in mixed income program funds to produce 1,379 units of housing. Letters were sent out to the applicants notifying them of the preliminary award on June 28th, and we're now working to complete the underwriting, and the initial commitments are expected in August. And October we will be on track to take those projects to meet the CIDLAC deadlines. We expect 6 of these projects to be presented to the board for approval. The MIP, or Mixed Income Program loans projects, range between $6 million for the large projects, which were 240 to 300, over 390 units, and $3.6 million for the smallest project, which is about 90 units. 6 of the 8 projects use CalHFA perm lending, and those projects total more than $187 million in CalHFA perm debt. The total permanent loans for the projects, including those with preferred lenders Chase and Hunt, is $226,165,000. The projects are geographically mixed, with 1 in Northern California, 5 in the Bay Area, and 2 in Southern California. Of the 1,367 restricted units, 94%, or 1,290, will serve a mix of low incomes between 30% AMI and 80% AMI, and 6%, or 77 units, will serve moderate income renters above 80% AMI. 73% of the units will serve a mix of low incomes between 30 and 60% AMI. Regarding the expanded state tax credit program, we will hear from a panel later on about the program, the timing of the regulations, and the implementation of the expanded tax credit program, so I'll defer to them on that. We had a board member who asked a couple of meetings ago about bond disclosures, and so I want to make sure that we're answering all of those questions. I know we are planning some additional training on bond disclosures, but just for the purposes of open transparency, we have issued one bond for Hookstone Apartments that was issued in November of 2018 for a loan amount of $23,090,000 with a rehab interest rate of 4.2%. Lastly, some important and upcoming conferences. We will be traveling next week. I will be traveling next week to the Executive Director's Workshop in NCSHA's National Workshop in Portland, Oregon, and that will be followed with the Housing Finance Agencies of the West Coast Exchange, which we have found very collaborative and getting good information, and that's usually Washington, Oregon, and the state of California. And lastly, at the end of the month on July 26th, I'll be traveling to Washington, D.C. with a group of NCSHA executive team to talk to Mark Calibria, the new director of FHFA, which is the Federal Housing Finance Agency, on some GSE reform and other issues that we're dealing with at the national level. And so, Mr. Chair, I think that concludes my executive director's report.
It's a lot.
It is.
Congrats to the team. That's awesome work. Good job. When does your term end as president?
October.
Okay, so you're still president.
And yes, I'm still president, and I'm going to be seeking re-election
Yes.
for a second term.
Even better. All right, let's move on to our next item, which is our governance training. I guess we'll ask Mandy to come on up now. Nothing like a little training. I feel like Mandy and I've kind of grown up here together. I remember when she first started and she was in the number 2 seat, and now she's in the number 1 seat. I think you've met Mandy before. She's a principal at Clifton Larson Allen, which is the 8th largest CPA firm in the country. She is their national leader for our housing industry, and Mandy specializes in auditing, accounting, consulting services for housing authorities, housing finance agencies, and HUD-assisted properties. Her involvement includes membership in the Affordable Housing Association of CPAs. I didn't know there was such a thing. And the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials. She serves on the board of Inwood Housing Development Corporation and the Braddock Carnegie Public Library. She's a member of the American Institute of CPAs, the Maryland Association of CPAs, and the Pennsylvania Institute for CPAs. She has a bachelor's degree from Salisbury, and she's a licensed CPA in the states of Maryland and Pennsylvania. And with that, the floor is yours, Mandy.
Okay.
Good to
Well,
see
thank you very much for that, Mike. I
You're very
appreciate
welcome.
that. I don't have this way. Take this one. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. I'm still a little bit on East Coast time, so I forget where I am sometimes in the morning. So, well, thank you all very much. First, how many people were here in September when I did this presentation last year? Okay, more people then. So it'll be a refresh for several of you, and for the others, it will be something new. So the board governance training, this is a great thing to have every couple years or when needed when there's new board members. I always find it I've been a board member for many years, and, obviously talking to a lot of boards, I always like to hear this information again, just so I remember my responsibilities as a board member. So we got a couple objectives for today. We're going to go over the overview of accountability and fiduciary responsibilities, and then we're going to talk about some specifics of CalHFA that is required for you all. In addition, at the end, I threw in, if you all remember last year, some fun fraud facts. I have some more this year, and some additional ones that we can go over, just so you all are aware of that kind of information. Okay, first of all, just the fiduciary responsibilities and the duties as a board member. You have three main responsibilities. You have the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. Today, we're basically going to mostly talk about the duty of care and duty of loyalty. And as you can see by the screen, duty of care, diligence and attentiveness to board responsibility. Act as an ordinary, prudent person would in a position. That one we'll go into a little bit more detail in some subsequent slides. And then the duty of loyalty. This one I always like to say is leave your personal interests at the door. So everything that you do when you're part of this board, you should be acting as a team related to CalHFA and what's most important for CalHFA and not your own personal interests. So always like to talk about that. And the last one is duty of obedience, which is pretty straightforward. I always say, just don't break the law. Just keep your nose clean for that part. Okay, for the next one to go a little bit more about duty of care. Obviously, some of this stuff is pretty obvious, I'm sure, so this is kind of a refresher for everyone. But, attending meetings and making sure you're actively participating in the work of the board. As myself being on a board, I know everyone gets a lot of information ahead of time, and everyone has a job, and you're like, how do I balance all this? But it is really important that when you show up to the board that you have a general understanding what is going to be presented, what are you going to have to be voting on, just so you can make a really informed decision. Recently, I was at a board where an individual hadn't checked his email, and we were voting on the audit, and he had to sustain because he was like, I did not look at all, I have no clue, I can't be involved. So it was kind of embarrassing for him, but so it's just something you just want to make sure, when you're showing up at these meetings, make sure at least you're going through the agenda, just so you know what it entails, and then if you need to go into the details, you know what's there, so you can be present and you can be giving your yes or no on a board approval. Scrutinize the work of committees. We are going to talk about, 2 committees today that you guys do have at CalHFA. And that just kind of means that, these committees of 3 people get together and work through things. But also don't be afraid to ask questions, what they're doing in these committees. That is your responsibility to be, trust, but also verify. It's a big auditing a line that we all use. But keep that in mind. Participate in the board actions, especially ones that you are responsible for. So depending on your role on the board, if you're a lawyer, if you're a real estate developer, if you're an accountant, making sure those specific agenda items that you're very invested in, because that's why you've been brought on this board, because your special interest that you can serve makes it a lot more important for you to be participating in those board actions. Know the books and records. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Obviously, that's talking about the financials. Tia brought up a lot of great financial information a couple minutes ago. So kind of having that in your head. Because you always got to remember, you are a cheerleader for this agency. It's always nice that when you're out in the public, you can, that kind of information that Tia just said, it'd be great to be out there and be like, hey, this is how great CalHFA is doing right now, and be able to reiterate all those great success stories that have been happening this past year. And then obviously the last one, protect the organization's assets, just anything, I know it's easy to say, but just following the law, just making sure that there's nothing, that's, anything with CalHFA when you're out representing, that you're doing anything out of the ordinary. Let's see. Okay. All right. So duty of loyalty. My favorite one is number 1, and we'll talk about a little bit later. I always say this is the biggest thing that I feel like could get a board member in trouble, conflicts of interest. And we'll talk about that a little bit. I know you all every year follow your annual 700, so we'll talk about that. Do not divert a corporate business opportunity for yourself for personal gain. Again, I always say if you're here to vote on something and somebody walks in the door that you weren't sure and you're placing a vote, don't be afraid to be like, I need to sustain. If you're not sure, don't do it. You don't want to get caught. where this usually gets people in trouble is this is the stuff that shows up in the news. It might not go anywhere, but it just looks bad. You know, it just never looks good when there's some sort of relationship out there that hasn't been disclosed. So it's always better to get it out there. And then the last one, just obviously I think people know this, just do not take gifts from individuals or entities unless you're disclosing it, but just be aware of that. You know, think of the cost. You all have a very strict rules in the state of California. So just, again, don't get yourself caught up with that, taking something that might just seem so easy, you know, but just think about it before you do it. So, and don't be afraid to ask the individual that's trying to give you something like, hey, how much does that cost? Like, I know it's a pen, but is it $1 or is it, you know, a $20 pen? So just think about stuff like that. Okay, so governance versus management. I think this is Tia's favorite slide. But this is just a reminder, you know, that governance, you all, you know, the ultimate responsibility of the board, and then responsibility of staff is management. The board is responsible for overall supervision and control of operations, while the executive director is responsible for day-to-day operations. I always like to say that the board has one voice. There shouldn't be 14 voices, you know, at Tia's ear. So make sure you guys are coming together as a group and communicating. You don't want to have some board members, obviously in the normal day-to-day discussions, you're all working together, but making sure at the end of it, you're coming together with one voice to Tia and to the management of CalHFA. That is very important to keep that in mind. Okay. So just the purpose of the governing board, if you guys haven't figured that already, which I'm sure you have, is provide organizational oversight, maintain accountability to the public and the law. You all are the ones that bridge CalHFA to the public. You know, the public trusts you all to make sure that CalHFA is doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that's very important. It's really nice when you see big boards like yourself, lots of great people on this board, you know, everyone's from all different kind of backgrounds. And the public looks to that, you know, and they trust that, okay, if the board's doing good, the board's voting, they trust you all that everything's going well at this agency. So that is important. The board must ensure the future, the mission, effective governance, and effective operations. So everything that you should keep in mind as you're serving on this board. And if anyone has any questions, please jump in. I know I talk fast, but I don't want to have you here all day. Okay, so some additional requirements, and this is to go over just the specific requirements that are for this board, for California. So the open meeting requirements. Meetings conducted in public with 10-day advance notice. Only vote on matters properly noticed and on agenda. You know, the majority cannot communicate with each other for CalHFA business except in open meetings. That is very important to make sure, you know, outside of, you know, this room, you know, you all are not meeting up. I think in Florida they call it the Sunshine Act. Is that what you're called here? Gotcha. So just making sure that nothing's happening, even in the parking lot. You know, after this meeting's over, don't be like congregating in the parking lot talking about what just happened. So just keep an eye on for that. Closed sessions are limited. And then finally, emergency meetings can be less than the 10 days. So that is all specific requirements for CalHFA and for the state. All right, my favorite slide, duty of disclosure of economic interest. So as I mentioned, and you all know, on an annual basis, you fill out that Form 700, making sure you disclose all your assets, any kind of financial interest, any kind of relationships you have. Again, this is extremely important. I know you're only supposed to do it annually, but you know, if there's any, you know, kind of major change, and you don't have to, but just keep that in mind. You know, even like I mentioned already, when you're at these meetings, like I said, if someone walks in this door that you know, keep that in mind also about disclosing that to everyone. Over the years, I was on worked at a client long time ago, and everyone on the board was related. And it was very odd, and we would go through like the general disbursements and look at checks, and everyone had the last name. So my old boss had to walk into a board meeting one time and basically bring up the fact that he thought there was way too many related parties going on in this agency. And he said it was not a great conversation, but it's a culture you don't want to be acceptable. So I think now you don't have that kind of culture, but you know, just keeping it out there, keeping it in the air that everyone's being, open, you're disclosing everything, so you don't develop that kind of, not so good of a culture for the board and your relationships with vendors. So keep that in mind. And again, like I mentioned before, it just, you always want to do whatever keeps you out of the news. You don't want to see your name, blasted across, because all these meetings are, put on, YouTube and everything. Everyone can see everything that's coming across, so keep that in mind. Okay, so then just to kind of talk about the financial reporting responsibilities. Obviously, as part of the financial reporting, the main people kind of involved, obviously you all, the governing body, kind of vote on the information, the finance department, and then obviously independent auditors, which would be me in this case. Big roles in all this to make sure the financial information, as Tia mentioned earlier, the information she presented earlier was not under audit yet. We're currently actually here on site conducting the annual audit for 6/30/2019. So hopefully if everything goes well with the pension and OPEB this year, we will finish in 2019. But I can't hold anyone to that yet. Hope they don't watch this video. So, all right, the next one, financial oversight. Again, with this, really take this seriously. When you do get, monthly, quarterly financials, when you get the audit, look at this financial information, look for any anomalies. Even if you're not like the strongest financial person, just kind of look through stuff that what to a normal, prudent person would make sense. Ask the questions, ask, management, ask the finance group, like what's going on. Because it is really important, because usually when you see some boards, in the news, it's because all of a sudden money's gone missing, or something's gone wrong, and it always gets back to money. So just make sure you're asking lots of questions about that. Now, you do have committees that are working through that. So you do have an audit committee. So, I mean, that is staffed with some individuals that do have some more finance background. I'm sure Mike and everyone on the committee with you takes an extra special attention to the audit, as you're required to do. So that's good to have that. So with that, we are going to talk about the two committees you all have right now, the audit and the executive evaluation committee. So the role of the audit committee, and as I mentioned, there are 3 members on that right now. And, as part of that, there is making the recommendation, selection, and retention of the auditors. Hopefully us, just to put a little plug right there. Go through the audit findings. So as during the year, as right now during the audit, as findings start to come up and everything, and as we, propose stuff, management will go to Mike and all them just to kind of keep them, ahead of what's going on, what could come down at the end of the audit. This committee does report to the board, and then you all hear out. And then obviously they review the committee's charter annually. I'm not sure if there's been any changes to that in many years, so, but that is a part of the responsibility that is on there. And then the role of the executive evaluation committee. Again, this is to evaluate the executive director and compensation of key exempt members. Recommends the evaluation of the executive director to the board, and then develop compensation policies and procedures, and then review and discuss management succession. So I'm assuming that board, that committee is meeting annually?
Yes.
Great, okay. And that's very common. The boards that I'm on, we have an executive evaluation committee too, so it's a very big thing out there. Okay, so then just a couple things, just a couple audit committee best practices. Possess a basic understanding of governmental financial reporting, access to at least one financial expert, have the minimum of 3 people, and obviously exercise professional skepticism. So this is characteristics that you like to see on an audit committee for them to be able to make, with all their roles, meet those roles and responsibilities associated with that. And then overall, the duties that come along with the audit committee, kind of what we mentioned before, provide the independent review and oversight of the financial audit, look at the internal controls, any other kind of reporting processes that should be, changed or updated. looking at the overall kind of established procedures for receipt, retention, treatment of complaints regarding accounting. I'm not sure I've ever heard any kind of complaints like that come through for you all that I've been communicated with. And then present to the board on an annual basis. So a couple of the duties for that. Any questions on any of that stuff before I move along to the exciting things? All right. So my fun fraud facts, and I came up with this myself, but on an annual basis, this information is put out. The CFE, they put this information out in a big booklet, and there's all kinds of information. You can see all kinds of statistics. So love to go through this stuff and see what they're saying. But kind of look at this. I think you guys see it pretty well. Okay, good. So can fraud really happen in my organization? So what I love about this is just it kind of shows you just like the tips and, you know, when fraud is really detected. And you can see tips is the biggest thing. You know, somebody basically, you know, rats somebody out. Usually where we see it. Internal audit is another place that kind of brings it forward. You know, I like this with employees provide over half the tips, so it's usually internal that the tips are coming from. It's not something from outside. And then it still says the hotlines. The hotlines are still pretty big. So 40% are detected by a tip from a hotline. This one is just kind of giving you, again, just kind of when things are with the fraudsters who have been with the company longer, stole twice as much, which you kind of hope sometimes that your long-term employees are the ones that are not going to do that. And then, you know, looking at here with the only 4% of perpetrators had prior fraud conviction. So sometimes, you know, and this is just to give you, just think about stuff. You know, I interview a lot of them in the room, Mr. Gunning, Tia, and I always say, could fraud happen here? No, never happen here. Never. But it's just for you guys to think, you know, just to be skeptical, you know, not to be, you know, mean or distrusting, but just to keep it in the back of your head. Okay, so this stuff is just kind of putting it out there for you just to keep it there. That you know, this stuff happens. This happens in good agencies. This one is kind of like the detection, like what was in place and how long something would take to matriculate and be caught. So you can see if you have good IT controls, which you all do, which is great, that it would only, the longest that the fraud could take would be 5 months, and it would only be $39,000. If it gets to the point where, you know, someone determined it was a document, so they found it from document examination, you can see it got to a lot more. So it's very interesting how like these detective methods to making sure you have the proper internal controls in place will really help out on limiting the amount of damage that can occur with a fraud. This one's just showing a little bit more about how the fraud was initially detected, just a little bit more showing. This one is never good for us because, as you can see, the external auditor is really far down. So we're not really good at detecting fraud, unfortunately. It is usually a tip or something internal. So you are your best defense of detecting fraud. We're looking for it. We're trying, but we're not the best defense against it. And you can see here, too, the different kinds of hotlines, the most powerful, most popular. And this is a new one from last year. Again, just kind of some anti-fraud controls that are most common in the United States, and just kind of saying that the median loss in 2018 was about $108,000. And as you can see, code of conduct, and people don't realize how like having that code of conduct and people seeing that in black and white is really important to have that, you know, in place. But there we are, we're back up, external audit. So people think that having the audit is a deterrent also, so. And I liked this one. This was kind of the bottom right. I like the one with the men and women. I don't know if you guys can see it that well. But it kind of goes through different things, saying how when a man commits fraud and when women do. Us women, it's usually financial difficulties. We got divorce, family problems, or inability in life circumstances. And men usually do it because of wheeler-dealer attitude.
Wheeler-dealer.
Excessive pressure from within the organization. So I thought that was interesting to kind of, and they actually had more statistics of the genders of when each other would commit a fraud. So, and then also these kind of like the red flags. So I kind of thought those was very interesting to kind of just to show out there. It's not who you think is going to commit the fraud. Oh. And that is it. I did add a picture this year, so try to liven it up a little bit. I tried to add a Bitmoji, but I wasn't allowed to. But does anyone have any questions regarding that? Anything just based off of that? Anything keep you up at night that you'd like to talk about now? Okay. Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mandy.
Awesome, thank you, Mandy. All right. Frances, you're up. Let's hear what that building is doing down the street. Or not doing.
So good morning, Chairman, members of the board. I'm going to be providing an update on the state legislative session and the recently enacted state budget. This will serve as background. Can you hear me?
Yep.
This will serve as background and context for the discussion on reforming California's tax credit program and bond program that will follow. As you can see in slide 2, titled Where We Are in the Legislative Session, we are past the equator in this year's legislative calendar. We have passed the May 31st deadline for bills to clear their house of origin, and now each house is busy scrutinizing the bills passed by the other house. This week, bills must pass their respective policy committees, which is a first filter they must go through in the second house. By the end of August, bill tagged as fiscal must also clear the appropriations committee in the second house and must be passed by the full chamber by September 13th. The governor has until October 13th to sign or veto bills. As you can see in slide 3, titled Bills That Are No Longer Live, many relevant bills are no longer active this session, having failed one of the legislative deadlines. Amongst them, the one receiving the most attention has been SB 50, Senator Wiener's density bonus law, which was held in the Senate Appropriations Committee. Other bills that are no longer live this year include legislation to expand the welfare property tax exemption up to 120% AMI, provide tax credits for affordable housing developments in opportunity zones, create a tax increment program for projects near transit, or Assemblyman Chu's proposal to revive redevelopment. As a reminder, bills could be gut and amended, so it is possible to see any of these concepts revived under a different bill number. In any case, these bills will get another chance next year as the California legislature runs 2-year legislative cycles. I've classified the bills that remain in the session into 4 buckets: housing finance, accessory dwelling units, tenant protection, and land use and planning. I'll go over some of the most relevant bills, but this list is by no means comprehensive of all housing bills still active in this session. We're tracking about 60 bills, still down from about 100 earlier this session, and I want to give a special thanks to Courtney Pond for her help with the legislative tracking. Within the housing finance bucket, there are a couple of bills that seek to consolidate the application process for state affordable housing programs. One of them, AB 1290, would have CalHFA and the State Treasurer's Office set up a stakeholder group to discuss how to best merge CalHFA, CIDLAC, and TCAC applications. The other, AB 434, relates to HCD's programs. There are another set of bills that seek to create local housing finance agencies. One of them is sponsored by the Los Angeles Mayor's Office and seeks to create a housing financing corporation there. The other one establishes the Housing Alliance for the Bay Area, a regional entity with taxing powers envisioned in the CASA process. In the redevelopment arena, SB 5 by Senator Bell is the last active proposal for a revived redevelopment framework, and 50% of funds in SB 5 would be going to affordable housing. There are also several bills relating to tax credits and exemptions, including a tax credit for Section 8 landlords, a new historic rehabilitation tax credit, and an extension of the welfare exemption to Melrose fees. There is also a constitutional amendment that will lower the voter threshold for local affordable housing bond measures from 2/3 down to 55%. And Assemblymember Grayson has a bill mandating the posting online of impact fees, and he has also a separate bill for localities to provide a number of housing metrics. Accessory dwelling units continue to be a big theme in this legislative session, and there are bills that mandate statewide ADU standards, speed up approvals, reduce their impact fees, and even allow ADUs to be sold separately. The next bucket is tenant protection, and the most prominent bill in this area is AB 1482 by Assemblyman Chu, which would establish a statewide rent cap of 7% plus inflation up to 10%. The bill has recently been amended to incorporate just cause eviction protections, which were previously in a separate bill that died earlier this session in the Assembly. There is also a bill to prohibit discrimination against tenants with Section 8 vouchers. This is often referred to as source of income discrimination. And lastly, but certainly not least, there are a number of bills still active affecting the land use and planning process. The most prominent one still alive is probably SB 330 by Senator Skinner, which applies a series of measures to localities experiencing high rents and low vacancies. It speeds up and adds certainty to the permitting process, prohibits downzoning, and makes certain changes to the Housing Accountability Act. Senator Wiener recently got and amended a bill to also strengthen the Housing Accountability Act. The last density bonus bill still alive is AB 1763, which would provide a density bonus for 100% affordable projects near transit, including those with a middle income component. And there are also bills granting CEQA exemptions for supportive housing, making amendments to SB 35, and there's also a constitutional amendment to repeal Article 34, which requires voter approval for low-income housing.
And does that one require a statewide vote?
Yes, it would be on the ballot, correct. So that's a bird's eye view of the legislative session, and now I'll turn to the state budget. As you can see in the timeline titled Budget Timeline on slide 11, the main budget bill was passed on June 27th, and the housing trailer bill was passed just last week. The only remaining steps is for the housing trailer bill to be sent to the governor's desk and the governor's signature. The pie chart titled Main Housing Components in the State Budget visually represents the different components of the $2.4 billion investment in housing and homelessness in this year's budget. There are $250 million in planning grants for regions and localities to help them prepare for the sixth cycle of RHNA. There is $500 million for housing-related infrastructure grants through HCD's Infill Infrastructure Grant Program. There is $650 million to fight homelessness for counties, large cities, and continuums of care. And then there's also $500 million for CalHFA to finance low and moderate income housing, and a $500 million expansion of the state's low-income housing tax credit. In the next few slides, I'll focus on these last two components since they pertain most directly to CalHFA. In addition to these funding amounts, the housing trailer bill also provides judicial remedies for housing element non-compliance in the forms of fines up to $600,000 per month and the appointment of an agent of the court to bring jurisdictions into compliance. As mentioned earlier, the budget provides $500 million to be administered by CalHFA to serve a broad range of incomes. This is a statutory appropriation in the trailer bill. It's not in the budget bill. What this means is that this funding will not be subject to the annual budget process in subsequent years, and there will be allocations done automatically in the following 4 fiscal years. This investment will leverage billions of dollars in private capital. And the expansion of the state LIHTC program is also of great significance to CalHFA. And as you know, California currently has a $100 million state LIHTC program. So this would add $500 million on top of that. The expanded funding would only be for new construction. It would provide more equity per project than the current program, 30% compared to the current 13%. And 200 million will be reserved to be paired, up to 200 million will be reserved to be paired with CalHFA's mixed income program. In 2020, TCAC will allocate credits following 4% and bond rules. And in 2021 and beyond, the trailer bill directs TCAC to develop a new methodology to award the credits. So the implementation of the LIHTC expansion will require quick action on the reg-making front at TCAC, and also underscores the urgency of more comprehensive reform to our tax credit and bond programs. We hope that the panel that follows will be informative in that regard. And with that, I am open to any questions that you may have.
Mr. Russell, sir.
Yep.
Do I have to say my name?
I said it for
Recognize me,
you.
okay. Thank you, thank you, Chair Gunning. First question is to our Executive Director, which is, so what exactly is the role of our legislative? We monitor, we provide information on request. We are not actually advocates for this. Okay,
No.
just want to make sure we're clear that I understand. Just learning as a board member.
Yes,
Make sure we're-
that's correct.
Okay. One other bill that I think under the finance might be worth tracking is SB 268 by Wiener. It was a gut and amend that was the Obernolte fix, they call it.
Okay.
The bill, the original Obernolte, forced so much financial disclosure information on the ballot statements that it became impossible to actually describe what it was going to do. And so it's under negotiation right now. I understand. I appreciate tracking that.
Wonderful. I will do that, certainly. Thank you.
Very good. Those are my questions. Oh, no, and let me add, ACA 1 is a big deal, and
Yeah.
struggling right now. I understand it was going to be heard today. 6 votes. They're working on trying to pull it together, and yeah. Any insights into how that's
No, I
proceeding?
do not, but I'm happy to provide an update when we have final word on that.
Okay, please watch
Yes,
that closely.
I will
That's
do.
huge, because that would lower the voter threshold to 55% for housing bonds, no longer allowing a minority to be a tyranny in these areas when we have such an urgency. And we could bring this in line with what school districts, of course, have to, the threshold that school districts have to observe in passing bonds.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Gallagher, go ahead.
Talk a little about the CalHFA program. So is this, how would we use those monies? Is that upsizing something we're doing already, or is that a new program for us, or?
Well, what we would do is, once the legislation is signed, we would internally come together and create an allocation plan of how we were spending those monies. And it's our intent to come to the board with the allocation plan to show you how we would be spending that money to meet the intent of the legislation. So we would come back before the board on that.
Francis, just note that Wiener's SB 592 deals with ADUs as well.
Yes.
And he's probably going to do some more amendments to that. So I'd kick that to the ADU category.
Okay.
And it's not SB 50, as a lot of folks tried to
Yes,
say.
that was the word initially, but yes.
I know. Comments, yes. Mr. Metcalf, sir.
Thank you, and thank you, Frances, for
course.
all you've been doing. I just want to highlight another piece of the housing trailer bill. You mentioned the accountability component, but there's also language in there giving direction to HCD to create what's being called a sort of a new pro-housing designation program. And for the benefit of the board, I'd just say one of the great challenges I think that we've all struggled with is, okay, we know how to hold cities accountable to just complying with state housing element, but we've always had a challenge about how do we really hold cities' feet to the fire to actually build new homes, because so much of that depends on economic conditions, market forces, so on and so forth. And what the direction in this bill is, that hopefully will go to the governor soon, is basically to come up with what I would describe as a scorecard of the policies that we know that if cities enact them, the research is clear that it will lead to fewer regulatory barriers and a greater likelihood of housing getting built. I think of it like a LEED checklist, or sometimes you drive into a city and you see the sign saying tree-friendly designation. There's a bunch of things that the research shows if cities do them, then we are much more likely to get housing. And so the idea is that scorecard could then inform giving funding preferences, for example, to cities. So if we're looking at programs, other housing programs, or transportation programs administered by the state, we could begin to reward those cities that have done the hard work of removing those barriers and giving them a little bit extra lift on their funding opportunities. So stay tuned. It's within the trailer bill.
It's AB 101.
Yeah, thank you.
Or 102, 101?
101, yep.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments from the board?
I'm very happy to
I
be
was
here.
going to do, go ahead.
Chair, I was just going to weigh in and say, although I think we've been talking about this for a while, I don't want to be remiss in really just overlooking the excitement, and the opportunities that await us, I think, through the additional allocations, but then I think through the very intentional collaboration across agencies. And so definitely kudos to the work that the agency is doing in terms of oversight and management. I just really appreciate this presentation. As someone who spent their first decade of their career in labor and really understand the importance of community engagement and empowerment, this will be a great tool to take to people to help them understand the process and intersections. So definitely appreciative of that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that, and of course, we all know that Tia's role through all of this, I call her the silent hand. She's working on all this. And Frances, I have to thank you, because I know a lot of questions came my way, and you were there and ready to answer them for me. So very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Seeing nothing else? Frances, thank you. Why don't we move on to item 6? Mr. Kroger, I believe. Yeah. Vince, Mr. Kroger, and one other gentleman.
I am Jim Kroger.
You're Kroger?
Yes.
The group. I know Vince. Who's the other guy?
Pardon? Chair, my name's Caleb Roop. I'm a affordable housing developer.
Thank you, Caleb. I'm sorry, sir.
That's all right.
Go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I was invited here by Francesc to cover some items including affordable housing cost studies that I've been involved with, and also to comment a bit on what is driving high housing costs in affordable housing, and just in general, we're seeing that across the housing industry. So I work at Novogradac & Company. We're a certified public accounting firm. Nationwide, I've been there about 25 years, and I focus on low-income housing tax credit and affordable housing. I used to do this nationally, taught workshops in Alaska and Kansas, and now California. Plenty of work here. So I really don't travel much anymore. There's plenty to do here in California. So Francesc gave me a list of questions here, and I'm just going to go through those. And feel free, if you have questions as I go through this, to stop me. I brought here some light reading, some of the cost studies that have recently been performed. These are all quantitative cost studies, which is unusual. They actually dug into the numbers. There's a couple hundred cost studies out there, mostly qualitative, but there's only maybe just a dozen or less, and just a few recently that actually dug into the numbers. So I was involved in a cost study that we performed in New Mexico. We looked at costs, affordable housing costs in that state, and we also compared it to Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and Texas. So it was a very challenging cost study. Francesc said, "What did you learn from this?" And what I really learned is that it takes a lot of time to do these cost studies. You start off thinking, "We got this. I think we can get through this," and it's a process. I talked to the GAO who did their cost study, which I brought here. Took them about 3 years, and they talked to me at the beginning, and I could tell they were very optimistic that they were going to get through this in a year, and it ended up taking them 3 years. I'm not surprised. It's compiling the data is a challenge, and then analyzing and isolating cost drivers is very challenging. Trying to compare apples to apples, right? And you say, well, is it urban projects cost less than rural because they're in urban areas? Or is it because they're larger? Or is it because, it's for seniors and just on, or when it was built, when construction started, what sort of community opposition? So it's challenging, but you can try to draw some conclusions. And I think it's important to look at these cost studies. Definitely, you need to think about it, but it is a challenge to isolate the cost drivers. Okay, so Francesca also wanted me to comment. What did we? Yeah, it was challenging. But what did you actually find? Well, one thing we did find that was pretty clear is larger projects cost less. No surprise, but we found that in our study. The California study done at the same time as ours in 2014 also concluded that. The GAO study found a very significant correlation between project size to the extent of $85,000 per unit savings when you move towards larger projects. So that's huge. You're doing 100 units, you just saved $8.5 million by doing a larger project as opposed to detached family homes. So we explained that to New Mexico, and they tweaked their program a little bit. They have a lot of single-family detached homes on tribal reservations. That's the type of housing that's built out there. So you have to make choices. You say, well, do we want more units, or do we want to kind of stick with this design that's more common in the tribal areas? So anyhow, they appreciated the work that we did, and I think they did tweak their program a little bit to not encourage the smaller projects. And yes, question?
Stephen Russell here. So when you talk about size, are you talking about cost per unit or cost per individual housed? So is it bedroom or unit?
Right. I'm talking about total units. So when you get up to 60-plus units is when you really see the savings. But that's a great question, which is, what are we talking about here? Are we talking costs per bedroom, per square foot, per unit? So the industry uses a per unit cost as kind of the more common standard. But then you have to adjust that conversation to say, well, your project's SROs, mine's 4 bedrooms, so we can't compare. You have to normalize all this data. And we did that in New Mexico by looking at the 221D3 limits and looking at the difference in costs on a per bedroom basis, and then normalizing the data to like a 2-bedroom roughly size per unit. And we also did that with project size when comparing between the states. So there's a lot of number crunching and getting the data comparable.
And then a follow-up on that through the chair. When you say larger projects, to finally land on that $85K per unit less, what were the two final kind of comparison numbers used to be the threshold?
Right. So in the GAO study, they said larger projects, and they had a pretty high standard here, which is why the savings is so great. More than 100 units cost $85,000 less than smaller projects, fewer than 37. So that was a pretty extreme example.
Okay, thank you.
We might just also know that HCD has kind of recognized this issue a bit. Ben might speak to this, but they specifically have meaningfully increased their loan limits and done some other things to encourage larger projects. This is probably, if I had to pick as a developer, and we've built about 15,000 units of affordable housing in about 200 properties, to give you some perspective. We also do market rate and affordable housing. And this issue alone is probably, I'd say, one of the top 3, if I had to pick one, maybe the top one, that really drives per unit cost down if you can do larger projects. And really we see that threshold being kind of over 100 units as really starting to really meaningfully make a difference. And it sounds like the study, Jim, was basically that same kind of conclusion, was 85,000?
Yeah, the GAO study had 85,000. The California study that CalHFA, HCD, and TCAC compiled a few years ago said for each 10% increase in the number of units, the costs went down about 1.7%. So every single study came up with some sort of savings for larger projects.
Thank you for bringing this up, like front and center. I mean, I think this is sort of the one thing that the state agencies, not just HCD, but certainly also TCAC, took away from the 2014 study. And I think there have been a number of policy changes in the last few years, not just loan limits, but also preferences in scoring, also some of the limitations on, that it historically limited developers to only submitting a single project. I mean, a number of other factors. And I think so it'd be great. T and I have talked about, maybe it's a good time to go back and rerun that cost study. I would put an asterisk on that finding, though, which I think, Jim, you'll agree with me, which is, you can only get so much units on a certain piece of land. And so what we have heard and seen is as you get past a wood frame, particularly as you get past a wood frame construction type and into steel and concrete, those cost savings immediately start to fall away. So there's sort of this sweet spot where you're probably maxing out under the building code at 5 stories of wood or whatever, but you can't really get more units than that no matter how much you want to.
Right. Yeah. No, thanks, Ben. Once you start to get up over this from the California study, over 4 stories, and TCAC has adjustment for that to help developers with that. The costs do go up, and significantly once you get up to 8+ stories. Now you're just going the opposite direction. You're almost starting to double your costs for high rise. But that's to compensate for the expensive land that you bought, and again, you're making choices, right? You need housing in San Francisco. It's going to cost a lot, so it's all about choices. Yeah.
So, I'm just sitting here trying to imagine it in my city where you could find enough land to do 100 units of any kind without having to then go up in a way that you've lost the advantage.
Yeah.
So it to me, the thing that number prompts is this whole issue about density and planning and where are we going to put units, and the character of neighborhoods have to change.
You do get savings with something less than 100, even over 50+ units, but yeah. Okay.
Because it really does tie into land use, especially communities, that, San Francisco County versus Contra Costa County, where a lot of land use policies were single-family homes, and now with the urban limit lines of protecting a lot of open space, it's really restrictive of how that need doesn't coincide with what's left. And so kind of curious of how the analysis is kind of going to address those communities that overbuilt through urban sprawl and then did land use protections of open space. And is it revitalizing through tearing down and redesigning cities? Just kind of curious, because there are a lot of communities, Preston left, but Fresno County would be a different story. So it's very different throughout the state of California, and then where the workforce is tied to the housing.
Well, I can give you a perspective on that. And as a developer, we probably have about 50 different sites that are in consideration for us right now at any one time. And we're finding that with the land use laws that are available to us, that with density bonus law, we are finding sites that can accommodate 100, 200, 300 units on a pretty regular basis. I'll give you a good example. The city of Oxnard recently rezoned their whole downtown to basically allow density. And this is a warehouse site that's on 3 acres that now we can fit 180 units on that property. And that was never contemplated before. But there are cities that are embracing the density argument, and they're starting to do things from a land use perspective. But it's absolutely from a land use perspective. That's where it has to start. And then the state laws that are being passed are very helpful. So I think that while there are communities that you do have trouble building density, there's a lot of places in the urban core that you can build density, 5-story over podium, and have a feasible project. And we're seeing that kind of across the state, Southern California, Northern California, even in the Valley, Sacramento. So I think that the marketplace is there for us to execute.
Which I think a lot of what also, and maybe we'll get to it later in the presentation, is another major determinant of cost is experience. Right, so I think a lot of what you're just hearing in terms of Caleb's responses to some of the variables that have already been mentioned is the asterisk related to experience and how that plays into ability to navigate site selection, bundle, sequence, right? And how some of those things may be hidden costs in terms of development that I'm not quite sure how do we get to identifying at some point. But that's always kind of the additional variable as well, just even with this dialogue happening right now in terms of what you're articulating versus what the common understanding may be versus the realities of a microeconomy.
Yep. Okay. Another question that Francesca had for me was how do we, or can we, compare affordable housing to market rate projects, right? The general public likes to make that comparison, and the answer to that is they're not comparable. They're not even the same, right? We have developer fees that we see in affordable housing that you don't see in market rate. That's maybe 10% of the costs, and the market rate guys don't want their fee up front. That's taxable income. They're going to get it from cash flow. They're going to get it on the back end. So right up front, that's not comparable. The whole NIMBYism that affordable housing faces versus market rate, and market rate has it as well, but it's much stronger on affordable housing. That's huge. All the public hearings you got to go through. Design review, I think, is more stringent on affordable housing. What other costs, Caleb?
Well, I can just say that the scale issue, we come back to the scale issue, market rate projects are going to tend to be much larger projects because they need to be, because they need those per unit costs to come down to make it feasible. And that's one of the major factors. The other one I would just add to it is time. A market rate developer is proposing a project. Once he gets through the land use approval process, he's pretty much good to go with his building plans and starting construction. His financing path is relatively certain. Well, in affordable housing, guess what? Now that you're entitled, it's time to get in line for the various subsidies you need to get funded, and you may or may not get them the first round or the second round. And then one of the biggest enemies to costs is time. You know, construction costs have been escalating at a 5 to 10% clip per year. So imagine if you're affordable housing, the market rate guy got to get going, and you're sitting there in month 18 after entitlements. Now you're going, right? So it's a different situation we face on the affordable housing financing process.
Right. So given all that, it's surprising that when a comparison was made between the two, that affordable housing actually came out pretty close. The California study and our New Mexico study, we found that the affordable housing was more than the average market rate, but less than the top market rate. So to see that affordable housing is pretty close to the average for market rate is, I think, impressive given the hurdles that affordable housing faces. And it's difficult to do that comparison because we don't have the data for market rate. So the way we did it was we used the RS means estimator, 3 factors, zip code, project size, and type of project. And we took all the projects in the New Mexico study and compiled all that data into RS means, and then also compiled all the market rate data to get apples to apples. And that's the best we could do. There's an RS means construction calculator that has 2,000 inputs, galvanized nails, all this. It's like we're not doing that. It's just not practical. But the California study and also ours did do some broad comparison.
I will just say that many of you probably know Carol Galante at the Turner Center associated with UC Berkeley. I just did an interview for her and her team, and it looks like they're going to be coming out with some good current data cost study for the industry that's going to look at market rate and affordable. So stay tuned for that. That's in the works and might provide some helpful insights to us.
Ms. Gallagher, go ahead.
So you talk about land use and the importance of that. Inclusionary housing units versus like pure affordable. I mean, from what you're saying, that sounds like there should be a difference there in terms of the cost per unit.
It depends, because sometimes inclusionary housing projects are going to come with free land, and so that taking land out of the equation can definitely manipulate the data. But I think generally inclusionary housing from a cost perspective is not going to be substantially different than your average affordable housing project. If inclusionary housing tends to show up more in a suburban setting often, and so you might see more garden-style type product in those markets. Therefore, maybe not as expensive on a per unit basis. You know, as you're building walk-up product, it's going to be less per unit than urban infill 5/1 product. But so when you really look at data, it's tricky because there are so many variables, and kind of equalizing those variables is one of the challenges.
Mr. Russell.
So staying on the issue of cost here, so the state policies, San Diego's on the forefront, I like to think, of greenhouse gas reduction, forcing development around transit priority areas, things like that. Land costs have got to be an enormous part of that. As we as affordable housing developers don't really have choices. We really need to go to those sites.
Right, right. I mean, again, it's a trade-off. Building in those areas solves the 2-hour commute that people face.
And the opportunity.
You're right. I mean, there's 10,000 employees that go to Tesla every day, and they each have like a 2 to 3 hour commute. You add that up, just the carbon footprint of that, you know, versus, okay, so we spend a little more money to get some housing in these urban areas where the housing's needed and where the workers are. And then you have to make choices when it comes to the sustainable energy design of that property. I think that the requirements on affordable housing developers is a pretty high bar, and maybe that should be scaled back a little bit to increase production. If you get more units, you're now solving the congestion issue. So it's about choices.
And there's just strong arguments to be made that the best carbon reduction strategy you can do is not insulation, it's location, right?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's a factor to be considered, for sure. You know, another hurdle for affordable housing is just the type of communities they're building in. Often it's blighted areas, and you know, they're choosing the challenging projects that a market rate guy is going to not. Yeah, exactly. So what's interesting is the GAO study that, as I mentioned, had many, many hours, probably, I don't know, 10,000 hours in this study. They did it over many years. It did not, at the end of their study, they did not criticize the program for costs. That was not one of their conclusions. You know, they identified California did have higher costs than most states, to no surprise, but they didn't criticize that. I think they understood the reasons why affordable housing has high costs. They did recommend potentially doing contractor cost certifications, which the Tax Credit Committee does right now for related contractors and developers. They don't do it if you're not related. You know, maybe it should be done in both cases. I'm not sure, just something to consider. So, okay, other questions from Francesc. Francesc, feel free to chime in if I miss anything here. One question he had was for-profits versus nonprofits. We get that question a lot. Is there a difference? In New Mexico, we did not see a difference. We did in some years, we didn't in others. It depends on the projects. Again, you have to look at what the for-profits and nonprofits are doing. The GAO study did find a difference. So did California, but then they had explanations as to why there might be a difference. So I have the studies here if you want to read that, and they're also available online.
Could you give us a reference?
And to be clear, I believe at least the California study did find a relationship with the capacity, right? So there is a correlation, I believe, that has been documented between the capacity of the developer and the degree, also some of the vertical integration with construction, you know, those issues. And so clearly we can say, well, you're going to get higher costs with a shop that has not done very any affordable housing in the past versus one that is larger. And there may be and certainly there is some degree to which probably there's a greater collection of nonprofits that are perhaps lower capacity, smaller size, less experience, whereas the for-profits tend to be larger firms, I think. Maybe that might be part of the
Exactly. If you have a vertically integrated for-profit, there is typically cost savings, and nonprofits, some are doing that, some don't, and if they're not, then they're usually not as cost effective.
Just, Melissa, would you make sure the board gets copies of that? Thank you.
And perhaps we could put on the record a reference so that people listening could find the reports.
Yeah, and Francesc has an email with links to all these. They're all online.
Just make sure we all get copies, get that. Yes, Suzanne.
so interesting. I'm just curious, you're talking a lot about capacity of developers, but what about the cities in which they're in, both from an economic fiscal standpoint as well as just, capacity and experience in working with affordable housing developers? Was that were there any findings to tease that out?
We did not look that closely.
I can tell you the actual
in California, not Idaho.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, I develop, 90% of our work's in California, so, we have 10,000 units down here. Absolutely. There's jurisdictions that understand affordable housing, understand what we need on the financing side. They're great. They process things. There's others that don't want you around. So it's more of a, you're in a cram down situation, and they can make life very difficult for you, right? You're here to try to serve affordable housing, the low-income people in their community, and they don't care about that. They just don't want to make those neighbors mad, right? So it can vary widely. And really the local government, redevelopment going away really also hurt because a lot of those same staff people really understood affordable housing. So, the local governments have been slow to get back to stability and still aren't there. And I'm not just affordable housing roles or redevelopment roles, but just planning roles. We're seeing cities that literally can't process applications because they don't have the staff to do it. Gilroy is a town that's been super supportive of affordable housing. We built 400 units there recently. They just literally don't have the manpower to review applications right now. That's the challenge. And they're working on it, but, there's not like, people sitting around doing nothing that know this stuff and know the rules. So it's a real challenge for sure.
I guess the perception, though, it's not the planning, but the city council. What's your impression?
It's both. I mean, the planners, if they have a pulse of the city council, they're the gatekeepers, right, to all that. So if the council's, politically aligned to shut us down, then the planners are doing that part to do that. I mean, that's our experience. But however, if you've got a city that's producing things, that wants to see housing built, the staff seems to be in line with it. And so it really is just sort of a manifestation of the political will in the community. Because at the end of the day, the staff that has to present this project up there in front of the council, they don't want to get creamed. So they're going to try to implement that. And what we're trying to do as best we can, and this is sort of my advice to my colleagues and developers, is lay down that suppressing fire of state law. Like, come in there and say, look, I don't want to approve this project, but the state said we have to do this. And so I try to help the staff learn about density bonus law and other, SB 35 and things that basically let them have cover so that they can go to their elected leaders and say, look, we don't have a choice. We're going to get sued. We'll lose if we get sued. So let's just get this approved, and let's get as much as we can to mitigate this project from a community impact point of view, and that really becomes the approach. But it's really understanding the law. That's one of the best things I could ever coach developers on is know the law, because there's a lot of state density bonus law and other laws that are really helpful to educating, and most of the staff at the local level do not know these laws, not to mention they're being passed right now, some of them. So how do you, you're just trying to process a planning application. How are you going to keep track of legislatively what's happening? So, that kind of stuff we find is very helpful.
Tia Boatman-Patterson for the record. Just to back what Caleb is saying, that is why you saw in the governor's budget the $250 million to local government to help them with planning and staffing and consulting to help them get ready. That is why you see in the governor's budget and his proposal the directive to HCD to come up with pro-housing cities. It's all to get at some of these things that Caleb is talking about, the lack of capacity, not just with the developer's experience, but at the local government, their capacity issues.
I guess a follow-up question or to UT is there something that we have through various committees, bodies whose job is to educate local electeds? Is there something that we can do, because even with the money coming, if there's a knowledge gap, right, that exists, is there something that we can do through some of our already established vehicles to make sure that the connection occurs so that when the money comes, at least kind of in the first tier being kind of the more pro-development cities, we kind of address that as well?
I'll let Ben speak to this, but there was a lot of technical assistance to local governments that was provided in both SB2, and I'll defer over to Ben.
Yes, the good news is we're sort of already going down this path with the Senate Bill 2. The perm source funds, half the first year collected, were earmarked for technical assistance to jurisdictions. So we actually have a notice of funding availability that's up and open. We have, I don't know, probably a dozen or so cities who have already come in with their first proposals. But critically, we have under contract PlaceWorks, which is a very high-capacity planning organization working with the Institute of Local Governments, which is affiliated with the League of Cities. They are out there up and down the state working with jurisdictions to help them think about what their highest and best use would be for these funds that are flowing and will be flowing. They are putting together, regional collaboratives, peer-to-peer learning exchanges, and although we haven't built our pro-housing scorecard dashboard yet, we've already identified sort of 6 indicators of success that we're basically saying to these local governments, if you're going to start somewhere, start with these 6. This is a good starting place to start from because the research is already out there. So I think a lot of this is already happening. And then lastly, I'd say we've also found there are a number of other folks out there in the housing ecosystem who are helping us amplify this message and are working like the League of Cities. But we've also been working very closely with the councils of government who themselves, the MPOs often have, and some of the bigger ones like MTC ABAG, SANDAG, others are working to try and build some of that capacity in-house to play some of that technical assistance role too. And in the governor's budget proposal, we saw half of the planning grant money actually tagged to go to regional governments then to play that supportive, facilitative, intermediary role, which we think is going to have a lot of benefit.
Although I do like the idea, I made a note, Kayla, about developers should know the law and inform their cities, because that really is the folks doing the deals and can have a critical role in that.
I was just about to make a crazy suggestion, because I'm not one to put requirements in place, but we build these properties, and our staff, some of them they have to go to compliance training, right, to make sure that you're renting to the right people. Management companies have to do this. We've seen states put in place compliance training requirements where you have to attend the class. Why won't the Treasurer's Office or CalHFA put in, training requirements so you have to go and study land use law, somebody from the developer staff, and prove that you went to the class and, hire a consultant to put it on. I mean, I'm just saying, the more that you're required to do something of that nature, you're going to have the chance to go to a class and learn it, then that's going to spread the word. I mean, it's just something to consider.
More or less. Mr. Brown, go ahead.
Yeah,
sir.
I'd like to jump in here. For the record, Vince Brown, Special Consultant for Treasurer Ma and Acting Director for TCAC and SIDLAC for 14 days.
He had to get that in.
Just to respond to Mr. AG's question about technical training, TCAC received some additional resources via the trailer bill, thanks to finance jumping in at the last minute. However, SIDLAC did not receive any resources. We are currently trying to digest the impact not only of the new programs, but our ongoing programs. And I will tell you that we are experiencing severe backlogs in different program lines. We are also right now trying to figure out if we are going to have some legislative BCPs to try to get additional resources so that when we jump off in 2020, we will have the capacity to do things. It's very difficult, as most folks understand that have been involved with the budget. And for some of you who don't know, I was Chief Deputy Director of Finance for 3 years. And the BCP process takes a year. You'll be behind by the time you get the new resources. So when you think about adding different responsibilities and different roles, you also have to take in consideration the process to get additional resources.
Mr. Russell.
I would be remiss if I didn't highlight the role of the nonprofit sector, the regional organizations, the statewide organizations, the nonprofits that through our conferences and peer-to-peer learning are really a part of that network. And so we do train, our developers are hungry for those laws. They love nothing better than to go to City Hall and say, you gotta, you better, that kind of thing. So we're there and are there to continue to serve, and we look forward to working with you and helping promulgate these new laws as they are passed.
Yes, good.
So thank you for citing the $250 million in planning for the local governments. And I know when we met with a lot of stakeholders, they talked about technical assistance and wanting that and that gap in terms of education. But generally, we heard from a lot of pro-housing jurisdictions. And I'm wondering if you could speak to strategies or ways to kind of get people at the table who are more in the other, the jurisdictions that are non-compliant and who have real issues, either politically, there may be groups there that want to do more pro-housing policies, but politically the will isn't there. And so how would you go about even beginning sort of the training of people who don't want to necessarily build?
Yeah, I'll just take a first stab at this. So I sent Francisco a list of all the, you guys already know this, there's a lot of research out there that supports all the intangible benefits from affordable housing, job creation, local money, even tax money that comes into that area. So financially, it can help a lot in a city. I mean, Caleb, you're going to have probably more boots on the ground experience with this, but
yeah, I mean, the big challenge is you got to overcome the fiscal argument, right? The fiscal argument is for local government is that housing doesn't pay, and they have a point. The taxes that are generated from the property doesn't really go to them that much, so they have a real challenge. So you have to basically, build that narrative around how does housing help them have a community that sustains those other kind of businesses that they really need from a tax-based perspective, whether it's sales tax in particular. So, we're really trying to focus on, when we're talking to local government, it's like, well, do you really want your people that are spending money in your community on the road for 2 hours, right, to get to your town to work? I mean, that's a big issue. And so anything we can do for traffic congestion type issues, if we can center housing around jobs, my hat's off to the HCD and the Treasurer's Office for doing things that are encouraging sort of the high resource areas where the jobs are and the schools are. I know there's a lot of political issues with that, but at the same time, I think those policies are helpful to that endeavor. So I think what we got to do is we can't make the fiscal argument on the money itself, but the National Association of Home Builders has done a study talking about the other fiscal impacts. Jim was kind of alluding to that. We need to be in front of those and communicating those. We try to talk about those, but then also some of the other benefits that aren't directly related to money in their budget, but rather how do they help their businesses and their community be more successful, and that's really where housing comes in. That's how we're doing it, and it's hard work. I mean, it's and it doesn't always pay. I mean, really, but it's hard work, but it's what you got to do.
Mission driven.
Yeah.
And you can go to the Rental Action Campaign for district fact sheets. I think a lot of you guys, I know Ben, you've been. They have some great statistics on. It's amazing the results that affordable housing produces. Mm-hmm. It's significant, a huge benefit to the community.
And it is why you see this impact fee thing. Why are the impact fees so high in California? Well, that's what local government is doing to try to counterpunch the fact that they don't get much fiscal reward from the regular taxes that the properties generate. And for affordable housing, it doesn't even pay property taxes, so they don't even get that. So I think we understand what local government's trying to do, and disclosure of impact fees I think is really important because we hate getting surprised. Those can be big surprises. So that's a great bill. We hope it makes it through. Yeah, for sure. But we just find that when we're going to be in a situation, the more we can understand what they're dealing with, the better off we are, and the more that we can give the impression that we understand their challenges, like from a fiscal point of view, that really produces the space to actually have better conversations because we get what they're going through. We're not just there to do the housing; we're there to help them deal with their concerns too. So that's kind of how we approach it.
And I think clearly with the governor's approach with the carrots, that's going to be the way, right? At least we're going to try that. We'll see. Jovan?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of tie back to Vince's point on the sort of CDLAC and TCAC staffing issue, because it's sort of a compartmentalization of issues, right? There's sort of the low-hanging fruit things that maybe we can do to move the needle most expeditiously because it's already within our control. Mm-hmm. And then the second compartment being those things that maybe are a little bit further away from our control, right, to influence. And so on the technical assistance piece, while it's there to build capacity for local governments, can some of that assistance be used to sort of in lieu of immediate staffing needs at CDLAC and TCAC be brought in to kind of fill some of those gaps as well?
I mean, the technical assistance that I was referring to previously is limited just to local governments in terms of helping them deal with overarching supply issues.
Got it.
I would say that we have HCD has engaged a Lassar Development Company to help us build out an in-house curriculum. We're actually going to be embarking later this summer of piloting a sort of, I call it a Affordable Housing 101 retraining for every single person at HCD who touches our loans and grant programs in any way, shape, or form. Partly we're doing that just because we know we need to get better and smarter. Partly we're doing that because we're doing a lot of hiring. But our full intention is, having piloted this year, to begin to open this opportunity up more broadly. That said, I think in this initial pilot round, we have already reached out, and I know we have some CalHFA folks, I know we have some TCAC and CIDLAC folks who we're bringing in to pilot this, but certainly our vision has been that this would be an ongoing investment, sort of train the trainer model, open to other public agency staff that are in the business of underwriting affordable housing, just so we can all get more sophistication in the business.
Yeah,
So-
and I don't know if we have our number, but I mean, right now, we currently have a bottleneck. You know, I walked up to the 4th floor the other day, and, you know, we have piles of papers in terms of projects that have just been bottlenecked that, absent any of these new dollars coming in, would add a lot more inventory to the marketplace, right? And so I think that there's that dynamic, but then there's also sort of, with this new pressures coming, you know, how do we position ourselves to make sure we're aiding in that?
And to Javon's point, as I am the acting director of TCAC and CIDLAC, you know, I spent a lot of time upstairs with the staff, and when I discovered the actual mounds of papers, I told Jovan, go upstairs and you'll see why we have a backlog. And so we actually have several conversations on how to at least catch up, but that does not put us ahead.
Okay.
So we are looking at various ways to catch up before we implement these new programs.
So, Mr. Brown, is it a staffing issue that you're facing, like understaffing? Is it a training issue? Is it both? Is it something that HCD and CalHFA could potentially enter into an MOU with you all to help you all? I know we have done things similarly when Mr. Stivers was there, where there was a backlog of the 1098s. I can't even remember what it was.
8609s.
Yeah, 8609s, and we came together via an MOU and helped attack some of that backlog. So help us to understand what the issue.
Well, it's a couple of issues. And it's definitely a resource issue as we try to staff up. But again, as we all know, the BCP process is a year out. And so as you're trying to stay afloat to get the additional resources, you can fall further and further behind. And because just on the natural between TCAC and CIDLAC, the number of applications and the growth in their programs is increasing significantly this year. So you add that on top of the current staffing levels, and we're falling behind. What we're trying to do is get a little bit ahead of it, and if there's an opportunity for an MOU, definitely would be considered to tap into you guys. As both of you know, we do workshops as well. In fact, CIDLAC is doing 2 days of workshops, I think, this week. But it is a number of resources. Plus, you mentioned the training component. It takes almost a year to train the new people that do come in so that they are experienced enough to take on the more complicated process. So, it's a combination of both. And I'm fearful of both of those staffs becoming very frustrated and falling further behind before we even get to the new program.
Mr. Ross? 2 comments. One is, you're talking literal stacks of paper you're still using for applications?
There are stacks of papers that have to go to the IRS. There are documents that
You need paper copies to go to the
paper
federal
copies
government.
the IRS wants, and so
Okay.
I'm signing hundreds of IRS forms.
Wow. So that's one complete different issue. But the larger one is that this is a bottleneck here upstream. If we relieve that bottleneck, the next bottleneck is just the next phase. And we're talking about, when we talk about cost drivers, capacity issues along the entire supply chain. So underwriters, sites, underwriting on the developer side, the construction labor. I mean, all of this stuff. These are the drivers of cost that we're seeing. It's just it all adds time, and we're paying more for a very limited supply of labor at every stage of this process. And if we don't address that above all else, tinkering around the edges is not gonna change the system of delivery of housing.
Yeah, so I'll just close it out by saying we appreciate the offer for the MOU engagements, because again, I think it's important for us to have folks that have the expertise can hit the ground running, so we can not be the impediment in the housing production.
bottleneck.
That's right.
Go ahead, Suzanne.
Thank you. press the button. Suzanne Haig with the Office of Planning and Research. We're the land use planning think tank for the governor's office and for the state, and so very interested in just one other aspect that I think we haven't touched on, which is infrastructure finance. We're looking at, to the point that was made earlier about the externalities in terms of greenhouse gas reduction, as well as just social equity and cost associated with 3-hour commutes. And it's not just a financial cost, it's a social cost to communities. So we're very much invested in figuring out how to reinvest in existing underutilized communities, especially commercial corridors that I think have a ton of vacant and underutilized land. But, to put it bluntly, how many toilets do you flush on a surface parking lot for 500 cars versus 500 housing units that we'd like to see? So all that said, I'm just curious, any insights on municipal infrastructure finance, and in particular sort of things that we can do at the state level to help alleviate that link in the chain of all the cost factors?
Yeah, and I think that you guys are already kind of starting it by allocating money for the infill infrastructure grant program, so that's a big help. But it's really a local level issue first. The cities have to make the decision that they want to have, upzone these areas or change the zones from commercial to residential or to allow residential. And we are seeing that because, by the way, they're out of sites to zone for the housing element compliance. So we do see, I can point to city after city where warehouses and industrial areas and commercial areas have been rezoned to allow, if not full residential, at least residential on the upper floors. So I think it's there. I do think that there are things happening. To what extent across the whole city or whole state, I'm not sure. But we do know of cities where that is happening. And I think your infill infrastructure grant funding is going to be huge because those very issues you're talking about are like water lines undersized, sewer lines undersized, storm drain lines are undersized, and those are kind of the three majors. But with the parking reductions that kind of come with the state law, if we're close to jobs and transit, that kind of stuff, then we also have that opportunity to not have as much infrastructure related to parking and traffic, et cetera, so make them more walkable communities. But it starts at the local level, and you guys providing that incentive, I think, is great. That's a great first step.
Good. Mr. Brown, are you going to make a formal presentation, or do you want
Unless
to?
these guys are done with their formal presentations.
Okay. Go ahead.
Can I ask a question before we move off of the tax credit stuff? So opportunity zones are out there. Are you seeing that have any catalyzing impact, or what are you seeing so far?
I think the industry is still getting up to speed on that. A lot of money out there, as you've heard about and read about. Big investors in affordable housing, tax credit housing, are banks, and they aren't a perfect fit for that. They don't have a lot of capital gains, and that's what it's all about. But you can still use it to fill the gap. You can have somebody, even a developer, if he has some gains from another project, he can put it into the next project and use that sort of financing tool. So, but I think the real big impact hasn't hit yet, and I think that the conformity that the governor has for tax credit housing and also green energy, the fact that he focused on that is going to help.
Caleb, I'd be interested in your answer to that because you're looking for it, aren't you?
We are, and the answer is that for mixed income projects, it works well. When you have, if you're introducing a sort of additional equity beyond the LIHTC or the tax credit equity, that's when that value kicks in, or mixed use is the other one. We're building public schools on ground floor, housing above in Oakland. We're right in an opportunity zone. That's a perfect fit for it. And even if there isn't conformance at the state level, it'll still be a good fit. Conformance would be great. That'll be a great benefit. But the conformance might show up as 100% affordable, and most of the time that's not going to help, right? But mixed income, where you have a market rate investment component, or mixed use, you'll see some value from the opportunity zones, and we're definitely using that.
So just one last point. Francesca asked me if there should be an update to these recent cost studies. I don't think it's absolutely necessary. I think it's more important just to get feedback from developers who are, seeing what's going on right now, the challenges that they're facing. I know costs have gone up a lot, but I think the same the conclusions in these cost studies would probably be similar if you did another one today, just that the costs have gone up 50%. You know, it's not 300,000 is not the high end in California anymore. Now it's 600, 700,000 in urban areas. You have that change, but still the same issues. I think developer input is going to be key.
And I want to reiterate, I think, a point that Caleb made earlier. He kind of said it nicely, intermingled with other statements, but he had hit on sort of political will, and just the desire to do it. I think is critically important. I think you see that just with the cultural shift at this level, right? There wasn't any sort of mandate for us to start working better together. It was a desire to do so. And so I think when we really look at how do we incentivize best practices with local governments, and really kind of figuring out where that will is and how do we continue to incentivize that and hopefully influence that in other jurisdictions.
Any other questions? Comments?
All right, Mr. Chair.
Well, hang on a sec. Caleb, do you have a formal presentation you want to make?
No, we were just here to really work with all of us. So there's no formal presentation or anything. So he's got 14 days left. So
no, he's 14 days on the job. That's
so before Mr. Brown kicks in, I just did see our representative from Department of Finance come back and join us. There was a question about opportunity zones and tax conformity. I do not believe that made it into the trailer bills.
So there's still discussion on the state side for state opportunity zone conformity. The idea is, the intent during the initial discussions was to really to layer on sort of the federal opportunity zones, and then if there's some state conformity with that there would be additional tax benefit for building either affordable housing or green technology. And so that was something that we introduced in the governor's budget, and it's sort of the discussions continue to happen. It was not part of this budget, though.
Yeah, so I did want to make sure that we provided that clarity. One of the comments back that Mr. Roop had made was that when looking for opportunity zone investors and trying to pair that for housing, that it was best if it were mixed use or mixed income, that was a better fit. And participating in the National Council of State Housing Agency Opportunity Zone Task Force here most recently at the San Francisco conference, they too made the suggestion that 100% affordable didn't pair very well with opportunity zones because it was not marrying. And so I don't know if you wanted to speak a little bit to some of that, because I think this would be very beneficial for our representative from Department of Finance.
Perfect. So the affordable housing investors typically just can't benefit from investing in opportunity zones. They're not, they don't have capital gains typically. It's mostly banks. A lot of banks invest in affordable housing. So 100% affordable projects just won't be good fits for them. They won't be able to take the benefits. So that's one issue. And I think what I was suggesting is if you had mixed income projects where you had an affordability component, maybe the 20% at 50% or 40% at 60%, sort of the federal conformity that we pretty much live by. If those were the standards, then I think you'd start to see those mixed income projects take advantage of it, as well as larger mixed use projects where you have a meaningful ground floor, retail, commercial, school, something. And so those are the kinds of projects. And then you could have 100% affordable above that. Well, and under the governor's proposal, I believe that kind of project you could still benefit from the opportunity zone conformance. But on the affordable housing piece of it, really being mixed income is really the key, I think, for it to work.
That's good to hear. I think it hadn't necessarily been fully fleshed out if it was going to be 100% affordable versus mixed income. Again, discussions are ensuing, but that's helpful to hear. Yeah. Thank you.
Random question while we have Caleb here. Is that, you talked about building housing or other things over schools. That's not something I'm familiar with seeing much. Are you seeing that happening more and more?
I'm not seeing it happen on a broad scale, but we're definitely doing it because we have a background in building schools, charter schools and public schools, traditional public schools. So we're just seeing that opportunity emerge more on a redevelopment basis, in particular in some of the urban areas. But we just think it's a great use. We're also heavily invested in developing teacher housing, which is another problem that, the teachers can't live in the communities where they work. So kind of the combination of those things, we're seeing that particular combination of land uses also being very politically acceptable. You know, we talked a little bit about the politics of the local agencies. I mean, if we can add some of those kind of benefits to our program, it really starts to build, you know, broaden that stakeholder group. You guys are doing it with your mixed income program. I mean, you don't know what a difference it makes politically when we can go out there and say to the locals, oh, by the way, instead of just serving your retail and your maintenance folks and all the other people in your community, we're serving your teachers, your nurses, your firefighters, your policemen, right? So a totally different narrative for us. So I think the more we can build that into it, those essential service workers, nurses, hospital folks, that really builds the case. And so we're just seeing community acceptance sort of broaden with our approach. And I think other developers are too.
And I would just add to that, I think we're looking to incentivize, not necessarily in this next phase, but in the subsequent phase after this one, is ways to incentivize those sorts of developments because of the point that was made about where most affordable housing goes and the outcomes and social outcomes of those communities, but also looking at potential grocers as sort of tenants in sort of first floor because of some of the food desert issues we deal with. So how do we sort of incentivize some of those things and then begin to leverage some of our own investments better just under the treasurer's roof?
Yeah, let me add to that, as I think putting another former hat on, when I chaired the California Schools Financing Authority for Treasurer Chung, they are also exploring various ways to combine both building schools as well as trying to integrate them with other retail facilities and things of that nature. I know they're also looking at creating a program for housing for teachers. So that is another area in the Treasurer's office that could be explored at some time that might have a good role in collaborating with some of the housing efforts.
So thank you. Go ahead, Steve.
Amplify what Mr. A.G. said, which is regarding food deserts, because one of the things, for instance, we have communities that are resistant to more affordable housing, even though it is much needed because of disparate allocation of tax credits throughout the region that's perceived. But things like a sit-down restaurant, we have whole communities that don't have a sit-down restaurant, and affordable housing developers do not have tools to develop the commercial portion of these projects that are meaningful or reliable, and I think we need to be looking at that. So I am excited to hear that you're having some experience with alternate means of getting that opportunity zone nut cracked, because people are dismissing it right now as not relevant to our sector, and we've got to show and demonstrate how it really is and how it helps solve a number of different problems.
Okay, your turn, Vince.
All right, again, for the record, I'm Vince Brown, Special Consultant for Treasurer Ma, and also Acting Executive Director for CIDLAC and TCAC. I think we're all aware of the Governor's very optimistic goal of trying to create 3.5 million worth of housing in the state of California. The Treasurer is very committed to trying to assist the Governor in meeting that goal with the programs that we have within the Treasurer's office. Since January, the Treasurer has conducted 2 housing listening tours, one in January and one just recently in June. That included about 15 stops in California, and I think Javon was probably on most of them. The goals of the listening tour was just that, to listen to the stakeholders and get their input in regards to both CIDLAC and TCAC's regulations, policies, operations, and just generally the regulatory schema. We are now moving into the phase where we're going to try to deal with the regulatory environment. And we are, just like CalHFA, we're approaching this in a bifurcated manner. We do believe we need some emergency regulations to possibly interpret some of the trailer bill language, although the trailer bill language of the housing bill was very structured in a way that it gave us a very clear idea of how to implement the Governor's housing initiatives. And we believe we do not need a lot of regulations, but our general counsel and our staff will be working with CalHFA as we go through this process, because we have to do it very quickly. We have a longer term track where we're going to deal with some of the more controversial regulations over the course of next year, so that we're up and ready to deal with those in 2021. I will note that both staffs at TCAT and CIDLAC are embracing the idea of How can we improve the process? How can we improve our regulations, et cetera? However, we also have an enforcement role so that there are certain things that, particularly in TCAC, that we have to do because they're federal requirements. CDLAC, obviously we also have IRS requirements when we do financing, but we are looking at ways to try to improve the efficiency of that. I think many of you are aware that we started a joint application for TCAC and CDLAC last year. It is an online application. We are also going to be working with CalHFA as we go forward to see if there's some sort of synergy there that we can have a joint application across the 3 entities. And I do want to just underscore, and Javon's more familiar with than I am, but the regulations that we are drafting, the Treasurer has certain goals that she would like to see reflected with the implementation of the regulations. One, obviously, is to increase housing production, contain costs. We've had a lot of conversation about that. But again, I'd like to follow up on a lot of the stuff that we have maybe is just dealing with the symptoms and not necessarily the root causes of the housing problem. As we go through this, we talk about what are the cost drivers, CEQA, land use, NIMBYism, all those sorts of things that you can pile a lot of money on top of stuff and not necessarily deal with those things straightforward. And I'm sort of speaking out of turn here, Joanne, but that's not for the Treasurer, that's for me.
We appreciate it. Luxury of 14 days. Saying you want.
That's right. Also, to spur new technology and increase opportunities for people of color in the development and investment space, empower residents to be part of the revitalization, and increase opportunities for people to build wealth. And I do like the commentary about the grocery deserts in some of these communities. I think that really could be some sort of a spark for some of these communities. And lastly, we are still looking to fill the executive director position for CDLAC and TCAC. Javon is very familiar with these efforts, but I'm hopeful that soon they will be able to have someone in place at some particular point in time. However, I'm retiring, but obviously I will be available to come back, not as a retired annuitant, but to provide any type of information I can for the Treasurer, Javon, and the folks that come in. And having said all of that, there's a lot of work ahead. And having been in this business a long time, and when next year rolls around and they go through the budget subcommittee process and the policy committee process, they're going to ask, what have you done with all the money we gave you, regardless of how long it takes to implement and operationalize these new programs.
Agreed. Well said. Go ahead, Tia.
So I want to thank all the panelists, and I specifically want to give Mr. Kudos to Mr. Brown. I know he is retiring at the end of the month. He keeps rubbing it in, but he has a long, distinguished public service, so thank you, Mr. Brown, for that. But one of the goals we wanted to have to try to bring everything that has been happening and all the conversations that have been happening over the last a couple of listening tour sessions of the Treasurer, what the Governor's objectives are, and kind of have some truth-telling. I really wanted to have an opportunity to have some truth-telling around cost, and everyone wanting to always make a comparison between affordable housing costs and market rate costs. And I specifically appreciated the panelists who said they're just not comparable. And so I really want to go on the record with some truth-telling. Now, one of the things I don't know if we got into, because I stepped out for a moment, was cost-benefit that goes along with affordable housing and some of the community that goes along with affordable housing, and how do you and can you put a quantitative measurement or cost to some of those community benefits. I know that we all like wonderful things. It is wonderful. We always, whenever, you can always tell a tax credit deal. You know why? Because it's the best looking development on the block. But when we do those things, I think it is important for us to tell the truth that those things cost. And so we need to start thinking about those costs to the community benefits that we're getting for those, and prioritizing what is really important to us is for the state of California, and then speak to those things. And so I don't know if any of the panelists have any thoughts or things they wanted to conclude with dealing with community benefit, the way to measure community benefit, the cost of those community benefits, but some of the things we're getting from affordable housing that we aren't recognizing as potential cost drivers, but do add to cost.
Well, through the chair, I would just say that the biggest one I can think of, to keep it short, is we're talking about affordable housing being not only a homelessness prevention program, because folks get into housing that they can afford, but also a homelessness mitigation program with the permanent supportive housing that's getting built. And when you do the math, and you talk about the reduced emergency room visits and the reduced police calls and the other reasons that why Housing First model works, that's really one of the biggest economic arguments I can think of. The court systems, the hospitals, the police systems. We did Idaho's very first permanent supportive housing project in Boise, and Boise State University did a whole analysis of the annual cost, and that number was about $50,000 for a homeless individual on the streets, sort of dealing with all those, emergency visits, et cetera. And the whole idea, and we got the private hospitals to fund the supportive services, we got the county to fund the supportive services, and the whole argument was we can spend 50 on the normal, or we can spend 10 with the Housing First model. And that argument, has been in place. So that building's up and running, and the savings are being studied right now because it just got finished a year ago. But the county and the hospitals just re-upped that commitment because they saw they could start to see, well, because they can track all the people individually, right? They know what John Smith is doing, how many visits he's had to the hospitals, to the court system, and they're starting to see, oh, well, you know what? He's in a stable situation. So, that to me, I'll offer that one as the biggest one. And we don't talk about, there's permanent supportive housing, but also affordable housing is homelessness prevention. Yes. That's what it is. So that's the argument I'm using when it comes up.
Just one comment along that lines. I think that the goals of the treasurer would include underneath the cost benefit, but also in looking at some of the ways that you build out communities and have community engagement. So I think that would be consistent with the direction of the chair where you're going with this.
I wanted to just mention, Tia, you stole my thunder. That's exactly what I was going to go to, because I know that there are at least two people on this board who actually lived in an affordable housing facility, myself being one of them. And I can definitely speak to, and I'm not sure if that's talked about in the study, how that stabilization created an avenue for ultimately me to get into this business, but moreover my kids to go to college and them to contribute back into the communities that they now serve. So I don't know if that was spoken about, but that is something that we definitely need to highlight, because we're missing the point if we're just looking at the cost going in, if we don't highlight the benefits coming out of it.
That's a very good point, having grown up in the Perry Projects in Buffalo, New York, to where I am today.
There it is.
Look how you turned out, right?
Exactly.
I made it to retirement.
Right. Mr. Russell, sorry.
I want to take the opportunity, we're talking about costs, and we didn't spend as much time on proposed changes to the LIHTC program, but I did want to observe that I think in many ways, the costs that we're talking about containing aren't within the program per se, and so to some extent, I think making costs such a factor in the proposed changes is like pushing string a little bit, that more attention needs to be paid to the externalities that we're dealing with. That simply focusing on cost and preferencing things that are lower cost has serious impacts with regards to some perverse incentives to build in lower cost locations outside of city centers, or to over-concentrate in neighborhoods that have been traditionally having a disparate impact in terms of social economic impacts. Proposed changes, for instance, to eliminate social service requirements, I think there's an incredible value and benefit to that I don't want, that we can't lose. When we go to communities and tell them that affordable housing belongs here, part of the reason is because we are there to help people achieve right? And it gives them confidence, security, and the longevity of the community really comes from the fact that it becomes part of the community and is connected to community connections and community participation. There's homework and financial literacy programs, all kinds of things. So I want to make sure, as we're talking about the LIHTC program as well, that we're not looking at cutting some of those things. And I just want to be really cautious right now when we have such a flood of money coming into the system to make changes that create uncertainty could actually have more of an impact of slowing down production than anything else. No matter what the changes are, if they're great improvements, introducing change in the middle of a significant flow of resources could be problematic. So we didn't go deep into the LIHTC program changes, but I want to make sure I've shared some of those concerns that I'm hearing from statewide partners on this.
Well, and to that point, one of the reasons we are addressing non-controversial regulatory changes, because we know there's already a pipeline with the rules and regulations that are already in effect. That major changes will occur based over the period of 2020 to be implemented in 2021. So that's the thought process in regards to that, because we do understand that you can't initial new regulatory changes for folks that are already in the pipeline.
A pipeline is a different definition. There's a formal pipeline, and there's
Right.
the multi-year
Out.
planning
Right.
that I think Caleb in particular would be familiar with. I mean, you're looking at horizons
Years
well
out.
beyond 2021.
Yep.
Thank you. And I guess I'd like to see more participation from the nonprofit sector in the discussions as we move forward with the LIHTC program changes.
Thank you, Stephen. Siobhan, do you have a final comment?
Yeah, I would just add, I think that, kind of just echoing the tone of the statement that Tia made about honest dialogue, I think is critically important. That's been a reoccurring theme through our various listening tours about the need for honest dialogue. If we don't have honest conversations about the state of affairs, we can't do anything about changing those potential state of affairs. And we also referenced the analogy that we found ourselves in 10, 11 years ago when Governor Brown took over. We were in a fiscal crisis. And although a lot of the things he said and how he said it we didn't appreciate, look at where we are today because of it. And so I think if we don't acknowledge the need for behavior changes at a moment of a crisis in housing, then we cannot fool ourselves to think we will have different outcomes. And so with that, I think that while we may be looking to figure out how do we first and foremost produce more units, we believe that it doesn't have to be a win-loss scenario, but how can we incentivize partnerships? Because one of the things we found through our listening tours that many people, in particularly distressed communities, are working in silos. And so how can we further advance educational institutions to do better jobs at working collaboratively with housing units versus having a housing unit build an educational facility which may be 2 blocks away from an already existing educational facility? So what can we do to sort of increase collaboration as a way to bring down costs instead of replicating and creating redundancy in communities, which we know trigger additional cost? So that's where we're going to be looking at how do we incentivize that sort of real community, even if we're defining community as sort of being something as block by block. And so that's kind of how we're looking to really move forward in terms of our culture, not abandoning our obligations, but doing it in sort of a new form. And so, but we agree 100%. That's one of the things that we've been thinking about is how do we do it in a way that doesn't disrupt our own intellectual capital, right? And then we'll have a learning curve in trying to figure out new regulations, which will also create sort of a slowdown in the process. But I would just say overarching honest dialogue, a commitment to what we've been doing it, but maybe in a different approach is something that is going to be the reoccurring theme into how we approach this.
Awesome, great. Anyone else have any other comments? Well, I want to thank you, gentlemen. Been very informative and helpful, and thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Great. I want to draw everyone's attention to the normal reports that are attached with the board packet. Is there any other discussion of board matters anyone wants to bring up? Go ahead, Jonathan.
I would just like to reinforce a little bit some of the things that Stephen said earlier about the bottlenecks in the system. It's kind of the unintended consequences of having lost a lot of expertise with the disappearance of redevelopment. And thinking particularly about the capacity of cities. I live in a fairly small city, and the amount of time it took just to get a water heater installed in an existing property, and that was taking people away from these larger, they have no time to think about affordable housing and land use planning and because they're trying to figure out how to meet code installing a water heater. It's a very simple transaction. And what strikes me is that we're looking at significant capacity issues all across the whole system for development of housing at precisely the same time that every industry in our economy is looking at significant capacity issues. And there's just a lot of expertise gaps. So in addition to, figuring out how to share across systems, how CalHFA and HCD can, provide staff time and do all that, there's also, I think we need to really be talking assertively to our education and training systems about the need for more expertise in these issues. And, we've got to figure out how the next generation of technicians is going to be created.
Well said, and I think Mandy talked about it too. As board members, we have a role to share what the agency's doing, what HCD's doing, what the treasurer's office is doing, and we as advocates for all of this can help in that process. I think so. Any comments from the public? Seeing none, I think we're adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.